Hi Legion, John Hittler, co-founder of Evoking Genius and co-creator of the Genius Discovery Process, with another edition of Pure Genius. How often are you stressed, like you feel heavy stress? Or how often are you fearful or tense? Do you ever get panicked? Gosh, as humans, we're subject to those emotions. It's just part of being human. The real question is, what does it rob you of? What's the magnitude of the fear or the stress or the panic? And what does that cause? Are you at your best when you're fearful? I know I'm not. Well, here's the key. What's the frequency, the longevity, and the magnitude of the fear, the tension, the stress, or the panic? Is it temporary? That's human. Is it permanent? Ooh, that's debilitating. Well, what if in 25 minutes you could eliminate 90% of the source of the fear, stress, tension, panic? That's what our aim is today. That's what we're going to do today on Pure Genius. We're going to give you a methodology to get rid of, literally, as the words are, blow up 90% of the fear, tension, stress, and panic in your life. Want to play? Great. Let's spin the big wheel. All right. Well, here's where we're going to start. When you're stressed or fearful or tense or panicked, or maybe take it in the context of you're working with your teenager, what are you leaking or what are you losing when you're dealing from that mode? Wow, when it's with my teenagers, they actually cause this fear, the stress, the panic. Well, okay, we'll get beyond that. But when you're dealing with a prevalence of fear or tension or stress or panic, you're losing, or what I'll call leaking, productivity, efficiency. What else though? Certainly you're not as productive as you would be. You're probably not as effective. Certainly you're not as efficient, even though fear is a great motivator. It can be short term, but over the long term, you leak. You leak joy. You leak laughter. You leak the pleasure of relationships. You're not fully present or at your best in your best relationships because you're dealing with an abundance of fear or stress or tension. Gosh, certainly nothing anybody wants. I know I don't. Well, the problem is your body literally cannot be joyful and tense at the same time. The two don't peacefully coexist in a biological way in your body. You can't be super productive and fearful or panicked. The body can't handle it. You can't be in two modes at once. A simple saying, you hear it a lot, you can't be dark and light at the same time. Stress, tension, fear, or what I'll call panic, especially when they're prevalent or permanent, eliminates some possibilities. And those possibilities all tend to be things that we want in life. Joy, laughter, great relationships, productivity, contribution, a sense of purpose. Those don't exist in full force when you're dealing with fear, tension, panic, stress. Well, so it probably is worth changing, huh? Great. I'm going to start with, I'm not a big fan of psychology, and I'll tell you why. We're going to start with it today, but I'll tell you why I'm not a big fan. If on a day where you're having a tough day, you take a psychologically based self-evaluation test, and I'll bring up Myers-Briggs. I like Myers-Briggs, but I'll pick on it a little bit because it's got a psychological bent to it. If you take the test when you're not feeling well, when you've had a tough day, you just came out of you had to fire an employee, or you had a little tough situation, you take the online test. And then a week later, everything's going your way. The wind's at your back, the sun's shining, you're having a great day, and you just closed your biggest client. And we showed you the results of both tests a week apart, you would swear it's two different human beings. That's always been my bias against psychology, is you literally show up as a different person depending on your psychological state of mind. So I don't like psychologically based answers. Biology is much more consistent. On those 2 testing days, biologically you're about the same, but psychologically you can be all over the map. That as my caveat or my disclosure, I'm gonna give a distinction or definition of fear that comes from Psychology Today. The magazine, very, very credible, very noted, and the distinction makes perfect sense. Here's what they say about what fear, how to distinguish fear. I'll read it. It's an anxious feeling caused by our anticipation of some imagined event or experience. Wow, what a great definition. I'll read it again. An anxious feeling caused by our anticipation of some imagined event or experience. You get the 2 keys in there? There's 2 big parts in there. One is it's anticipated. So we tense up or get fearful in anticipation of an event or occurrence. But what kind of an event or experience? It's imagined. Interesting that our brain imagines the event or experience and automatically classifies it as something to be fearful, stressed, or panicked about. Wow, what a great definition. Well, that's the psychological piece. Here's the trick. Our brain does not differentiate between real and imagined. I'll give you a quick story. When I was a little kid, we used to get spankings. In our house, I was one of 9. The first 7 came in 7 consecutive years. Irish Catholic, we were good producers, let's put it that way. The last 2 were spaced out a little bit more, probably out of biology, not out of psychology. My mom's body probably gave up, but that's a different story. But the way our household worked culturally, and it was the norm for the neighborhood we grew up in, the moms stayed home and raised kids, and the dads were in charge of discipline when they got home. That's just the way it worked. So if you got in trouble in our house, and shockingly, I was in trouble every once in a while, as hard as that is to believe, when my dad walked in the door, the first thing he would do is greet my mom in some reasonably appropriate way, and then she would give him the discipline report, because it was his job to dole out spankings. Oh! Imagine, he went and worked it, but that was just the way it was. He didn't think anything of it. That was his job. Those were the roles that parents had growing up in the 60s and 70s. Okay, well, shockingly, I was on the discipline list probably as much, if not more often, than any of my siblings. As hard as that is to believe, well, I was. So I'm 8 years old. I'm on the spankings list, and here was the problem. My mom would announce that you were getting a spanking when my dad got home. Okay. The problem was she would announce that after school for whatever transgression I had caused, and it was about 3 hours from the time that she announced it, and I knew about it, and the time that the physical punishment actually took place. You could calculate or escalate the amount of fear that would be created in that 3-hour window. So my mom would tell me at 3:15, all right, I've had enough of you. You're getting a spanking when your dad gets home. Oh my goodness. Well, now I knew what was next, because it was a fairly common occurrence with me, as hard as that is to believe. But now between 3:15 and about 6 or 6:15 when my dad walked in the door, I created that into being so scary and so horrific of an event that the fear was way worse than the actual 3 spanks or whatever it is. Never did he draw blood, never did it really hurt, but boy, I was scared to death when he walked in. And when the car pulled up, that was the height of the fear. And then 10 minutes later it was over, and whatever pouting or crying, and it was done with. And then probably the next day I was back in line. So, but you might have gone through that same thing. That time period where I had to leave it up to my imagination how horrible the spanking was going to be far outweighed the actual spanking. But the brain didn't differentiate between the two. I worked myself into a tizzy during that 3 hours of knowing I was going to get a spanking and the actual event. That's the way the brain works. Well, here's what happens biologically. So I give you the psychological distinction for fear. Here's what the American Medical Association, so now we're another reputable source, but now we're with the biological ramifications, or what the EMA calls the standard biological response to fear or prolonged stress. Wow, so this is what happens physically in your body. Not in your brain, but physically in your body. First thing that happens is you experience more fatigue than you would otherwise. Fatigue, just because I'm stressed or fearful? Why is that? Well, when you're fearful or stressed, and it goes back to caveman days, what happens is your body sends more glucose and oxygen to your major muscle groups. Because as a species, when we got fearful, usually we either had to fight or run. We call it fight or flight, but where do you need the oxygen and energy and glucose? You need it in your major muscle groups. Well, the fear and tension and stress that we experience in today's society isn't the same type, but the body's biological response is the same. It sends energy and glucose to your major muscle groups, which means you're burning up stored energy. So you come home from work and you go, I'm absolutely exhausted. Well, why? Because you had a stressful day. Well, the problem is you had a stressful day today, maybe you had a stressful day yesterday, maybe it's an epidemic of stress, and you're exhausted every day by what should be a normal work day. Well, fatigue is the first one. Second one, you get a higher blood pressure. What? Fear and stress does that? Yeah, it actually constricts the arteries and veins in your body. This is the same biological response that sends glucose and oxygen to your major muscle groups. It also restricts the blood flow from places like your digestive system. Because if you're running away from an animal in the woods millions of years ago, you don't need, in fact, you don't want your biology system to be burping. You want that to be stopped, so it constricts arteries and veins, and that actually raises your blood pressure. Oh, well, for a short period of time, that's not a big deal. But if it's prolonged, as we have today, like what I'll call an epidemic, or a chronic outbreak of fear, anxiety, stress, tension, panic, not good. It creates higher blood pressure. Not a very good thing for a prolonged period of time. Your body will release a series of hormones, but it'll start with a hormone called ATCH. I won't try to pronounce the long Latin-based name of that, but ATCH leads to an increase in adrenaline, again, so you can run, and the adrenaline then leads to cortisol. Now, cortisol is where we get in trouble. Short-term cortisol does the same thing. It stops your digestive system. It focuses the adrenaline and the blood flow to your major muscle groups, and that's great for short-term. But if you're constantly stressed, what it does is it leads to these, the cortisol leads to these outcomes, none of which are great. Weight gain. Well, shut off your digestive system, and what happens? All your food stays in limbo in your system. What happens is you're going to absorb more of the fat and calories, you're going to gain weight. Oh, not good. Higher cholesterol. Same thing. All produced by the cortisol produces more cholesterol. The end result is you get more cholesterol, so you get higher cholesterol. All through the digestive processes being interrupted. It's terrible for your heart because you get higher blood pressure, and that creates, heart disease is too strong, but it produces a bad situation for your heart because you're constantly at a higher blood pressure than you should be. So not good for your heart. Here's my favorite one of all. Premature and accelerated aging. Why is that? Well, you ever notice, you've probably seen it in the last 3 or 4 or 5 presidents. A president takes office, and if they if they rule, wrong word, if they lead or govern for 8 years, you notice how they look like they've aged 30 years during the 8 years they've been in the White House? Yeah, it's a pretty stressful job, pretty high stress. You got to fundraise, you got to lead the free world, you've got to you've got to fight Congress, you've got to get things done, you've got to run the military and foreign policy. Not an easy job, and the presidents that we've had, every one of them, looks like they've aged 20 years for the 8 years they served in office. And then when they get out, you notice they look different. They're smiling again. About a year, it takes about a year for their body to recover, and the stress goes way down, and they look great again. Now they have gray hair, but they age incredibly rapidly during the time they're in office. And this is the production and release of prolonged cortisol. It ages you prematurely. Wow. The root cause? Fear, stress, tension, anxiety, and what you might call panic. Wow. Not fun. Well, so let's add up our scorecard. All of those, fear, tension, stress, anxiety, panic, lead to premature and accelerated aging. Great. Higher cholesterol, hoping to get those numbers up. Lower bone density, I won't go into the biomechanics of that, but you get lower bone density. Eesh. An onset of mild depression that increases over time. So it's a trigger for depression. Oh, terrible. This all from the AMA. Well, I coach CEOs, entrepreneurs, team leaders, and individuals to create lasting behavior change by making transformation, like transforming fear into something more useful, but by making transformation safer and more attractive than standing still. Here's what standing still looks like. Accepting your stress level or your poor sleep patterns, also a symptom, or your poor working conditions or your depression as normal. That's what standing still looks like. What if you could transform that to something much safer, both physically and emotionally, and certainly something more attractive? That's what we do all day long. We call it coaching, but we work with this conversation all the time. People go, well, I'm panicked, I'm really stressed, or I'm not sleeping. It's all the same. Or I'm gaining weight, or I'm aging. It's all got the root cause. How do you transform it? That's what we do every day. Well, so let's start with, I'm going to flash them up on the screen here, and then we'll put them in a pyramid. So as I announce them, they'll get flashed on the screen, and then we'll show you what they look like. There's 5 basic kinds of fear. So we should understand those a little bit. I'll go through them quickly, but every kind of fear that exists that we have invented, and these days we're kind of a victimized society a little bit, there is a fear. You just add phobia to almost anything, and you go, wow, there's a fear of pink porcelain turtles that you can keep on your bookshelf? Yeah, they call it pink turtleophobia. Who knew? Well, we've got a phobia for everything. But the truth is they all fall in one of these 5 categories, probably as established by the UN Subcommittee on Phobias and Fears. I'm not sure, but you could look that up. Here's the first one. Fear of extinction. Now people would say, oh, number 1 fear is death. It's actually called extinction, and the reason is the death part is physical. The extinction part, or the emotional part, literally the fear is of no longer existing. So they call it fear of extinction. I get it. It's the number 1 fear. It's our basic fear as human beings, is the fear of no longer existing, or extinction, or death. Great. Number 2, fear of mutilation. Pretty self-explanatory. It's literally the fear of losing a part of your body or having it mutilated. We're fearful of that at a physical or at a core level. Third, fear or loss of autonomy, which in its highest level is freedom, but it would look like being imprisoned, trapped, immobilized, disabled. We're very fearful of losing our autonomy. You see this with your aging parents? They go, you can't take away my car keys. Even though I'm half blind, I don't hear other horns when they beep, and my physical reflexes aren't what they used to be, and I'm 87, I want to still drive. Why? They're fearful of loss of independence or being trapped like housebound. Number 4, separation, fear of separation. And this looks like being abandoned, losing your connectedness to people, family or friends, or fear of rejection. It all falls into this fear of separation. And the last one, kind of odd language, the fear of what's called ego death. What? Well, that's humiliation, shame, embarrassment, loss of reputation, or what is psychologists call integrity of self, quote unquote, integrity of self. Well, we're really fearful of that. We don't want to be embarrassed or shamed or humiliated, whether it's us doing it to ourselves or our family, like having a kid who's a misfit or any of that stuff. We're fearful of that. It's called the fear of ego death. So I put these all up on the screen in kind of a pyramid, because that's how they show up in models. The bottom one being the foundational one, and then one up, and you see how they look here. And all phobias or all fears fall into one of those 5. So whatever you're fearful of, you can kind of figure out categorically or thematically where it falls. But they all fall in these 5. So, as we said, the trick is the brain doesn't distinguish between real and imagined fear. Oh, so that's a problem. Let me tell you a story about a client of mine. He's a friend and a client. I've known him for a long time. I have his permission to retell his story. His first name is Lester. And Lester is an amazing guy. He left home when he was 15. Now, he grew up in an upper middle class neighborhood. Not affluent, but they were suburbanites. Let's call them that. At 15, he left home. Why? His family was so dysfunctional, both in terms of alcohol, but also violence, like physical violence, that he literally witnessed the murder in front of him of his stepdad. His mom had remarried, and there was an altercation in the house, and his stepdad was shot in front of him. Didn't take a rocket science to figure out that was not a suitable environment, and rather than wait for authorities to do something, he just left home. He said, you know what, I can do this on my own. Now at 15, that's a pretty gutsy move, especially because he wasn't educated and he was in high school and all that stuff. But he left home at 15 literally because it wasn't safe. Well, you can imagine the amount of fear that he lived with every day inside of his own home. And the only way to keep your sanity, says Lester, was to figure out how to deal with it. He didn't realize he was figuring out how to deal with it. He just inherently had to deal with it. So it took him a while. I said, you must have had like a methodology. Well, he wasn't thinking in terms of methodology. He was thinking in terms of survival. So he and I teased this out, and his insights are brilliant. And they're I'll call it a 5-step system for literally, as he says, blowing up fears. Wow, I love that. He just blows them up. How's he do it? Let's share his system. Here's his premises, or his tenets, as he calls them. Most fear, and he says 90%, is imagined. It's not real. Wow, so if you have 10 things that you're fearful of or stressed by, according to this system, 9 of them are primarily imagined. That's a shockingly high percentage. But we'll play with that in a sec. So his second tenet, which goes with the first one, is when imagined, the fear is between 2 and 10 times greater than if it actually existed in reality. Oh, go back to the spankings. I used to get 3 spankings. It's like 3 spankings with pants on wasn't that big a deal. It's like 3 spankings, I'm back on the street, I'm a released criminal, ready to do more harm tomorrow. That was my mantra. I was 8, 9, 10. That's just the way it was. 3 spankings was not a big deal. But imagining how horrible it might be for 3 hours before my dad got home and after my mom had announced that I was going to be punished was this huge big deal, like I might not survive. Then I get the 3 spankings and go, okay, that was it. I'd cry a little and boom, was I reformed? No, still not. They're still working on that. I'm a parolee running the streets and still running amok. But the difference between the real spanking and the imagined was his theory is right. It's somewhere between 2 and 10 times as big when you imagine the fear than the actual reality. Wow, brilliant. Well, his third one is, and we've said it before, the brain absolutely does not distinguish between real and imagined. And you know this when you go to a scary movie. You purposely go to a horror movie or scary movie or watch Freddy Krueger on reruns at Halloween or whatnot. You know, because the music is set up that way and whatnot, that sooner or later the bad guy or the monster or the zombie is going to jump out with a knife or with something. You know what's going to happen? You just don't know quite. When it does, your whole body reacts as if that monster is 3 feet away from you, and you literally jump. Your body jumps because your brain doesn't distinguish between a movie, which isn't real, and the actual bad guy or monster or zombie being right next to you. Your brain has no capacity to do that. So he's clear. First of all, we make it up to be 2 to 10 times as big, and then we don't distinguish between real and imagined. Not a good combo. Well, here's his secret sauce. Here's the blow-up part. This is for the 9 of 10 fears that he claims are imagined. He runs as hard and as fast as he can directly at the fear. Wow. What do you mean run directly as hard as fast as you can at the fear? Well, I'll give you an example. Your team there's a rumor going around work that there's going to be a reduction in force. Nobody likes a reduction in force, but the last 3 quarters, our profits have been down, our sales have been down, China's got a cold, we're looking at a recession. Oh my gosh, this is bad news. We better proactively, we meaning management or the leadership, better proactively trim our payrolls because we're not producing the way we did 2 years ago. That's the rumor. Now, when it's a water cooler rumor, what do employees do all day long? They talk about it. They make it bigger than it is. They speculate on whether it's going to be 10% or 20%, or they try to figure out, is one team out of 10 going to get cut, or is it going to be 10% across the board? Will I be included? Will it just be a 10% reduction of everybody's pay and they don't cut anybody? How's this all going to look? And fear and stress grip the entire organization. What happens to productivity? Right in the toilet. What happens to morale? Again, right into the toilet. Because the fear of a reduction in force, when the truth is, if it's a 10% reduction in force, you got a 90% chance you're going to be good. You'll be okay. But what the concern is, and this is the imagine piece, gosh, I'm going to lose my job. Oh, we're heading into a recession. There's going to be no jobs. I'm a provider. I can't be without work. Now, fear, panic, and stress grip the organization. Productivity and morale going into the tank, and everybody's dealing with an imagined fear because nobody really knows that we're going to have a reduction in force. Why? Senior leadership doesn't announce we're going to have a reduction in force. Please stand by and we'll give you details within the next 30 days. Never! Always, number one rule is you don't announce anything in advance. Well, how would you then run right at the fear and blow it up? It's a perfect example. It's a real world example and it happens all the time. Well, let's assume that in your company, like any other company, there's no way that HR is going to tell you, because they're not allowed to. There's no way senior leadership is going to tell you, because they have to keep this secret. And your team leader might know something, but probably not everything, because stealth or secrecy is the best way or the most effective way to deal with this. The problem is you're a provider. You're the sole provider. Let's say you're a single parent and you got a kid in college and a kid in high school. You can't be without a paycheck. The real problem is not that you're going to get downsized. The real problem is you can't afford to wait around for that eventual occurrence and be without a paycheck. So you got to find out something. Well, what would it look like to run right at it? Try this. You set up a conversation with your team leader, whom you've known for years and respect and they like you and whatnot, rather than say, hey, are we having a downsizing, or are we having a reduction in force, which they aren't allowed to tell you, and they can't even if they knew. You simply say, hey, I am a sole provider. I've got a kid in college and whatnot. If there's a reduction in force, I totally understand. Here's my question. I'm not going to ask you whether we're having a reduction in force, because I know you can't tell me. but if we do have a reduction in force, do I have to worry? Oh, so now the team leader can be secret and stealth, and even if they haven't heard from HR, they can tell you intuitively, you got nothing to worry about. Either because they say, if I have to trim 10% of my team, you wouldn't be on my list anyhow, you're safe. Or if they say, we aren't having one, good, then you're safe either way. But it's a way of running right at, as hard and as fast as you can, directly at the, and I'll say, imagined fear. We don't know that it's imagined, but there's a 9 in 10 chance it is. So if you handle it that way, you go, okay, there may be a reduction in force at some point, but I'm not going to be on the list. I have nothing to worry about. Great. Let's take it the other way. This is step 5 that he says. Step 5 is, and it's just a tenet, it's not really a step. His rule is, human beings are uniquely created to solve problems. So the 1 in 10 fears that's actually real, you were built to solve problems. You solve problems every single day. Challenges, problems, tension, whatever it is, human beings not only are good at it, they like doing it. Well, if you have that same meeting with your team leader and they give you a funny look when you say, do I have anything to be worried about? The real tension is not that you're going to even be on the cut list. The real problem is you can't afford to wait 3 or 4 weeks to find out and not start looking for a job now. So if you knew you were going to get 6 weeks of severance, even if you got cut, and they said you might want to start looking, oh, they just gave you 4 weeks ahead start to start looking for another job on top of the 6 weeks of severance. So you got 10 weeks of paychecks to find someplace else before everybody else that you work with is going to hit the streets and look for probably the same sort of position. You now can solve the problem of, I will be unemployed in 4 weeks and I only have 6 weeks of severance. Your body and your brain knows how to solve that. The real problem is imagining it worse than it is, which is, I'm going to have to call my kid home from college and tell him he's got to get a part-time job to help feed the family, and my high school kid, we're going to be on welfare, we're going to be out on the street, all that stuff that we imagine. It's not going to be that bad, because you'll be able to solve the problem. That's his 5th tenet. The 1 in 10 that actually is real, we are uniquely designed to solve problems. So go solve it. But the trick is, you got to blow up the 9 and 10, because you're probably spending a ton of time working on imagined fears that will never come to pass. And you're wasting your time on that and not on the one that actually exists. See how his system works? This is a guy from literally who had to leave home so as not to get physically injured or killed in his own house, by his own family. He has an intuitive understanding of this in a way that you and I probably don't, because we didn't live in that kind of an atmosphere. Brilliant. Well, is he fearless? Is Lester fearless? Absolutely not. He's got as many fears or concerns or stresses or tensions as we do. So no, he's not fearless. But his trick works really well. He uses his own trick. He's more intuitive about danger than you and I might be, but he runs right at it just to figure it out which of the 10 or which of the 5 or which of the 100 fears or concerns are real. And then he goes to work. Simple, brilliant. Well, his methodology around blow it up or solve it, that's my language for it, not his, but he either blows up the problem or he solves it. It's fun. The funny thing is, blow it up or solve it equals safer or more attractive. Remember I said at the beginning, we do every day is we create lasting behavior change by making transformation safer and more attractive than standing still. In this case, we make transformation, or we eliminate fears, you might say, by blowing them up or solving them. Either way, it's the exact same thing metaphorically or thematically. So, in the end, what we're really looking to do, physiologically, is slow down the aging process. That would be nice. Or lower your cholesterol. That might be a good idea. Or lower your blood pressure. Or eliminate fatigue and give you more energy. That's what it looks like when you transform your ecosystem or your daily existence and blow up 90% of your fears. That's what happens. You literally feel and look younger and improve your, lower your cholesterol and feel better with your physical health and lose weight, and the list goes on and on. It's just a choice. So here's the thing. You've got friends who have fears or concerns or tensions. It's part of being human. If this was helpful to you, share this with them. They'll be glad you did. Secondly, I want to acknowledge you because this is not easy. It's one of those things that's simple but not easy. And you've chosen to transform and get better. Lots of people don't. They're willing to put up with the status quo, or they're willing to live with more stress than they should because they simply haven't got the bandwidth or ambition or the courage to move forward. You do. Transformation or living a transformed life isn't for everybody, but it is for you, and my hat's off to you. Until we meet again on Pure Genius, all the best.